Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The Malaysian Substance Abuse Council, which is a coalition of NGOs that provide community services related to substance abuse, well, they have proposed that former drug offenders should have their criminal records expunged if they have been free from substances for 5 years. Now, joining us on the show to explain the reasons behind this call, we have the Secretary General of the Malaysian Substance Abuse Council, Raja Azizan Raja Suhaimi. Pak Ungku, thank you so much for joining me on the show. Can you begin by explaining why Masak is calling for the expunging of criminal records for former drug offenders? Kenapa penting bagi menghapuskan atau memadamkan rekod jenayah bagi mereka yang bekas penyalahguna dadah?
Okay, thank you very much. Terima kasih, Wanita, Astro AWANI. Actually, what we insist the government to look at is the akta itself. Kalau you tengok sekarang ni, akta dadah berbahaya tahun 1952. Saya yang dah tua ni pun tak lahir lagi. Akta dadah berbahaya tahun 1952 tak diolah. Kemudiannya akta rawatan dan pemulihan 83, banyak lagi yang kita tengok perlu dibaiki. Now, my question is drug using ataupun mereka mengambil dadah itu ada satu penyakit chronic lapsing brain disease or satu jenayah? We haven't decided. No, we haven't decided. KKM said is a mental issues, mental health. Tapi pihak penguasa kata jenayah. So the new trend of drugs now, the synthetic drug, is so dangerous because people who are professionals, they are using this because they need to do certain work, pilot, architect, nak buat detail. So if they are not lucky, if some pergi clubbing, kalau ada operasi, when they are caught urine positive, they will be charged under section 15A. It means to say, bila kena charge court, dah ada record. Walaupun cemerlang. I have a few young student, university student yang ambil ganja sekali-sekala main muzik, kena tangkap. Yang sedihnya section 15A ni, orang kaya, anak dia boleh bayar denda. Yang miskin masuk penjara.
Okay, so maksudnya if they have a criminal record, what happens to them? How might macam mana nak membantu individu yang ada rekod jenayah ni? What are the challenges they face?
Yeah, it's hard for student. They are expert from studies. Dah habis dah masa depan. Macam orang yang berkejaya dah tak boleh dah masuk balik bekerja. Dan juga kalau yang baru nak mencari kerja, bila di screenkan rekod dia, dah ada rekod, memang susah dapat kerja. But memang in fact, the government tried to get work for them even though dia ada rekod. Tapi cara kaedah tak kena, berkelompok. Contoh dia pergi ke Pelda, semua bawa 50 orang pergi Pelda. Semua bekas penagih di Pelda, kalau seorang spark, hisap semua jadi hisap balik. Jadi dia berkelompok. It should be targeted one by one. The only way to get one by one is bagi dia waive. I'm not saying they abolish. Waive dia record. Maknanya ada sistem yang mana mengenepikan rekod dia after 5 years clean. Kalau
sekarang ni tak ada sistem macam tu. Sekarang ni ada kira macam blacklist. Is that right?
Orang yang tidak dikenaki. Bayangkan. Dia punya kesalahan dia kesilapan, bukan kesalahan, pada saya kesilapan. Kesilapan dia mengambil dadah, tapi dihukum semua hidup. Jadi kita rasa pelik lah sebab apa mereka ni ada potensi untuk menyumbang balik kepada kita, pada masyarakat. Tapi dinafikan hak itu kerana kesilapan mereka memilih untuk mengambil dadah.
Okay. Pak Ungku, can you explain a little bit yang the way you said to have it more targeted, this framework of promoting employment for ex-drug offenders, macam mana nak reintegrate diorang dalam masyarakat? Is there a rangka kerja untuk untuk menolong diorang, menggalakkan peluang pekerjaan bagi yang ada rekod jenayah sekarang? while the kerajaan is looking at mungkin mengubah dasar rekod jenayah ni?
Yeah, the only way now that we find, we have to get them jobs not dengan dia punya kemahiran. Let's say dia ada bachelor degree dalam architectural ke science, engineering ke, kita tak boleh dapat. Kita janji dia ada kerja untuk meneruskan kehidupan. Sayang. Jadi maknanya at least kalau selepas 5 tahun, kalau dia waive tepikan rekod dia, at least kalau dia dah boleh mohon balik kerja yang dia mahir atau dia tahu memang forte dia lah, maksudnya begitu. Jadi buat masa sekarang kita tak boleh buat apa. Kalau yang paling sedih, kebanyakan bekas mereka yang keluar daripada pusat selentir atau penjara, kerja yang paling mudah mereka dapat adalah security guard. Sebab security guard will give them pocket money and also asrama. But they are usually been victimized by after 3 months. They sometimes maybe the pegawai ronda or what, they said, oh, you have to record, terminate without paying them anything. So they got frustrated and go back to drug. Ini problem dia lah. So you have to do this carefully. I think kita ada parole sekarang ni, penjara ada parole. So I think buka satu unit lagi yang mana jika penaja dadah yang dah berhenti dadah selama 5 tahun, dia confident, pergi interview. Come interview, isi borang dalam internet ke, pergi interview, so that the government can waive dia, ketepikan. I'm not saying abolish, ketepikan rekod dia. Kalau dia buat jenayah balik, rekod tu akan keluar semula. Kita kena carilah kaedah itu.
Okay, all right. Pak Gu, thank you so much for joining me on the show. That was Raja Azizan Raja Sohaimi from the Malaysian Substance Abuse Council. We're going to take a quick break here on the show, but we'll come back and explore this proposal to expunge former drug offenders' criminal records. Stay tuned to consider this. We'll be right back. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. Joining me now is Tamjiavan. She's an international engagement coordinator at the Anti-Death Penalty Asia Network. Previously, she was a researcher at the think tank The Centre, where she spearheaded a study titled How Do Malaysians Really Feel About Drugs? Javan, thank you so much for joining me on the show. Can you speak to any notable findings or trends in your research about how Malaysians view persons who use drugs, especially those with a criminal record?
Thanks, Melissa, for having me. So very quickly, my research last year covered a range of topics that involved drug offending, but we had a small section that talked about what about persons who use drugs as well. So this is very, very interesting for me to find in a nationwide sample, nationwide representative sample. We found some level of public acceptance towards the issue of drug addiction and people who are struggling or used to struggle with it. And in fact, a small majority of Malaysians actually showed some level of willingness to agree that these people deserve to be reintegrated back into society, right? But when we added the questions about accepting them back as neighbors or family members, that level dropped, and that was very interesting for me to learn that it's probably very easy for the public to say, we think these people deserve a second chance at life. We think they deserve to be integrated into society. But is there some level of some gap between that and accepting them as a very close circle of your personal life?
Right.
So that's a mismatch over there that I found very intriguing.
This is almost like the not in my backyard scenario,
yes,
right?
Yes,
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So Javana, what do you make of the suggestion by Masek to clear or expunge former drug offenders' records after they have been proven to be clean for 5 years?
I think first of all props to Masek for driving this call again. There has, as far as I know, there has been certain calls like that over the last decade at least. But what I think I can offer is that I'm fully supportive of that, but also we need to tackle what the public might think of it, right? As we learned from the rushed call for abolition to the death penalty, maybe the way we talk to the public, the way we create public awareness about what this means also needs to change alongside these calls, right? We don't want the public, like what I mentioned before, think it's just good as not in my backyard situation, but when these things happen, backlash might happen and stigma might turn into certain actions like excluding them for more opportunities than before, right? So I think there must be a level of matching between these calls and how we create a public awareness of what this means in terms of education sector, employment, housing, and so on and so forth.
How might we bridge that gap, Javan? I mean, if you were to suggest that bridging of that gap between the calls for the policy change and evolving our drug policies with the public attitudes that you found in your research, that may not be that may be quite conservative when it comes to dealing with former offenders.
So I personally have seen that the way we consume and form our perception about persons who use drugs or happen to be convicted of it, we form these perceptions based on media reports. We form this based on information we process from social media and so on, right? And a large part of it, I would attribute to the way we talk about drug offending online and in the media, the way we associate drug offenses with harsh crimes and so on and so forth, the way we report about arrests, addiction, and so on, that still has quite significant level of stigma to that kind of reporting that I think we need to tackle before we talk about reforming the way the public think about these things. We consume information, we form our perception, right? And so it becomes a self-serving cycle of never-ending stigma. So first and foremost for me, the way we talk about drugs in the media. Yeah.
Okay. What is it that, based on your research, you think is not being communicated? I mean, there is such nuance in the way we should be talking about people who use drugs or people who have criminal records based on drug offenses. What's missing from the conversation, Javan?
This might be controversial, but I think the way we talk about drugs is still so monotonous, if I may. It's a very one way of thinking. You're trapped into drug offending because of poverty and lack or vulnerable socioeconomic background. But I haven't seen a significant level of talking about it from using drugs to deal with stigma, using drugs to deal with stress, mental health issues that that isn't being mainstreamed yet in the way we talk about drug offending. So, for example, in my research, we actually asked our respondents whether it's okay for certain people to use drugs to deal with mental health stress and physical health symptoms. And actually, when we split that nuance up, there's actually quite a significant level of acceptance. So it's the way that we haven't really broken down the nuances of drug offending or using drugs in general to deal with these things that we go through in life. So I think if we can mainstream that kind of nuance in public convo, that would really help these kind of policy calls. Yeah.
Javan, thank you so much for joining me on the show. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Melissa.
Tam Javan, the researcher formerly with the think tank The Centre, currently with the Anti-Death Penalty Asia Network. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this. We'll be back with more. Stay tuned. right, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. Let's speak now to lawyer Sanggit Kaur Dio. Sanggit, thank you so much for joining me on the show. We're discussing the proposal to expunge criminal records for drug-related offences, former drug-related offences, this after 5 years of them being clean. Can we get your thoughts? What do you make of this suggestion?
Thank you for having me, Melissa. I think it's a good suggestion in the sense that if we are serious about talking about reintegration of persons who have used drugs back into our community, then I think we have got to be serious about records as well. I think I'd like to put it in context first. I think this subject matter has to relate specifically to drug users. Not traffickers and not the other categories of drugs. I'm talking specifically about those who have used drugs and have a conviction as a result of that use. Even that, Melissa, has to be, can be subdivided, because not all drug users actually have a substance use disorder. In fact, I think 80 or 90% of those convicted for drugs could very well be first-time users, recreational users. Imagine the 18-year-old at a college party trying a drug for first time, ganja maybe. You imagine him being convicted? He would be under our laws. The urine test would test positive. He would be convicted, and then he would have a record, essentially for a very long time in Malaysia. So now we're talking about perhaps considering limiting that record to 5 years. That term of 5 years is arbitrary. I don't think there's any study that's been done as to whether the right number is 2 or 5 or 10. Different countries deal with it differently depending on what category of offenses there are. It is also conditional. There are some countries that say it will be spent if there are no further convictions within a certain period of time. So these are proposals that we should be considering, particularly for those who use drugs. I think the answer here is always about reintegration. And if you have on record that 18-year-old who is just stepping into furthering his studies, stepping into the world of employment, you are setting him up for failure.
Can you help us understand the impact of a criminal record on a person? I'm just wondering how that might impede their employment opportunities, their chances to advance in their lives. Is there a list, a registry? How does that work for someone who has a criminal record?
So in Malaysia, you have registrable offences. We have a very outdated act, the Registration of Criminals and Undesirable Persons Act. I think it's in the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think we should even be labeling anybody as an undesirable person today, but that act exists, and therein lies the power to register those convicted of certain categories of offences. Drug use is within the schedules. In the entire Dangerous Drugs Act is considered to be a registrable offence. So now that is why you would get a record. In Malaysia, it doesn't get spent automatically. I think you can apply to the police to have yourself deregistered, but I think there are multiple issues that you would have to get through. So I think this country really ought to consider criminal records being expiring after a certain number of years, as many countries have, for all offences. Not only for drug offences, but since we're talking specifically about drug use, yes, resounding yes, that it has to be done. And in fact, that also has to be seen in categories.
I didn't realize that other countries had adopted this practice. What are the considerations for Malaysia when we think about the legal limitations or constraints if this was to be part of our drug policy reform?
Specifically, I'll give you one example, Melissa. We have recently, or not so recently, but we've had an amendment to the drug laws that now have introduced Section 39C. This is an enhanced penalties provision, 3 strikes and you're out, essentially. So if you have been convicted of using drugs 3 times consecutively, your 3rd time, it's a minimum of 5 years imprisonment. Now, let me give you a very real example of what that means on the ground. In fact, this is a real example because I was in court sitting at the back, and I watched this. A man was on his feet, and he had been convicted for the third time for a drug use offense. His second time, however, was almost 7 or 8 years before that. So you see that gap for which he must have been clean. And then because this was his third time, after that long, he went in for 5 years, pursuant to 39C. So that is where I think we need to address this, because, as I said, a lot of users who are convicted under our drug laws are not necessarily people with disorders. They could be your regular student who is trying it for the first time, or recreational use. Now, those people do not deserve to have this record on their history for the rest of their future. I think that's very, very damaging. So I think that's something that has to be seriously looked at in the whole context of our reform of drug policy in this country.
Well, that's a really good point, because I'm just wondering where you think the expunging or expiring of certain criminal records might fit into the broader category of reform. Where does it fit? What else needs to be looked at in the wider ecosystem to make sure that if this is implemented, it's fair and equitable?
I think, again, it depends on the category of offences. You've got some very serious offences such as rape, sexual offences against children, kidnapping. Those are different categories that require different considerations. You have countries that have imposed sexual offenders lists where your name appears on that list for some time because it provides a safeguard to certain communities. So these are things that we need to consider, and what the purpose is behind a record. What is the purpose? Are you trying to safeguard a community? Is that what you're trying to achieve? Because if that is what it is, then that policy must serve that purpose. But if it is, what else could it be? It can't be just to forever hold it against them, isn't it? That can't be the purpose. So if you're trying to tell an employer, be careful, you can't employ this person because when she was 18, she tried marijuana, I think that's the wrong purpose. So I think policymakers need to understand why they are having records, previous convictions on record to begin with. And then we work from there.
Right. So on that note, what do you think policymakers, advocates, the public communities can do to better understand, some of the legal efforts around this, and ensure that, individuals are not burdened with the criminal record of a drug-related offense in specific categories, that they're able to fully participate and reintegrate into society, which is part of our rehabilitative approach, right? Instead of punishment, we want to make sure that it's rehabilitative.
I think it comes back to what is it we want to achieve. At the end of the day, we're talking specifically about drug use. I think we all need to understand that just because you've used it once or twice and that appears on your urine test, that does not mean you have a disorder. And we need to establish a system that can define that or can ascertain that from this category of users who has a disorder, who requires treatment. Provide that as an answer so that you are addressing the source of the problem. Now, those who are using it recreationally, perhaps you need to have regulations around that, and not just immediate answer is to put them in prison. You are setting them up for failure. There's no opportunities when they come back out with a record on their backs. And essentially, you're not providing them any real basis for reintegration. And I think communities need to understand that when you don't have a record, you will be welcomed back into the community. No stigma. I don't think recreational users need to have this hanging on their heads.
Sangeet, thank you so much for speaking with me. That was lawyer Sangeet Cordio wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.